This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby podcast. This is Richard Blackaby. Sam, our host, is letting me jump in here because we have another special guest this week, my oldest son, Mike Blackaby. Welcome, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Been fun to visit this week and jump on the podcast while we're here.
Yeah, we actually, a sad occasion. My mother passed away and Mike and his family came down for the funeral. And so after we went through all of that, a very glorious, very moving funeral service. But before Mike leaves, I thought I would sit him down at the podcast table and get some wisdom from him. And so Mike's been on this podcast before. Mike, we don't have that many repeat offenders that come on, but
it's always nice to be invited, but it's always better to be invited back.
That's right. They can tell you that they really thought you did a good job, but if it's only crickets afterward, then. But Mike has a PhD in apologetics, as does my younger son Daniel. But Mike particularly did his dissertation and focus on Sam Harris, one of the leading new atheists that have become so famous in recent days. And I really thought it would be interesting. I'm a leadership guy. There's certain areas of my specialty, but apologetics is kind of out on the fringe for me. And yet I have a feeling that there's a lot of our listeners that are quite intrigued by that. There's so much going on in that field these days, and I just thought it'd be good to pick Mike's brain a little bit. We've actually had some various people that I've referred to Mike in the past because perhaps they had a son that was a prodigal or someone that was questioning the faith, and they just wanted to ask someone some questions. And so I thought that might just be good to bring Mike on today. And so I'm going to just kind of have him take us through just some of the waterfront. I mean, we can't do much in this short podcast, but Mike, why don't we just jump in here? And first of all, I think they're waning in some ways in influence these days, but there were four prominent atheists or new atheists, I think they were called, that kind of left quite a stir for a while. And maybe just tell us, kind of give us a quick overview of who those guys were.
Yeah, so in the early 2000s, Sam Harris actually was one of the first ones to. These guys weren't the first to say the things they were saying, but they were maybe the first in a long time to sell millions of copies saying what they were saying. And Sam Harris was one of the first with a book called The End of Faith, and there hadn't been a whole lot that criticized religion with that sort of passion. And people have always criticized religion, but that book really got a lot of traction. I think it came out in 2004, and then Richard Dawkins came out with The God Delusion, I think in 2006, and then Christopher Hitchens came out with God is Not Great, just maybe a year or two after. And Daniel Dennett is sort of considered the fourth guy in that group, but he was kind of less well known than the others. He had a university teaching position, and so he sort of had they all had day jobs other than this, but they really hit the scene in the early 2000s and gave voice to a certain kind of atheism. It was sort of similar to what like Nietzsche had done before, where it wasn't just sort of a logical critique of religion, but a very passionate, no holds barred, and they saw religion as something that was almost above critique. Like you sort of had to dance around it because it was so personal for people that oftentimes they felt you weren't even allowed to really critique religion, and so they just like busted those doors open and said, well, why can't we critique it? And not just critique it, but critique it and actually mock it. Because they said it's not just that religion is untrue, it's that it's actually dangerous and it's actually causing the world to be worse. And so if it is, then it should be critiqued in the harshest terms possible. And so they did that, and they garnered a following, mostly of other people who were angry at religion too, and who appreciated the way that they said these things. And many of the folks who really jumped on board that train were those who were pretty frustrated with religion themselves, and they were glad to finally have some spokespersons to say in that sort of terminology what they maybe felt and wanted to say. And so for a while there, they made some pretty big waves, not just critiquing Christianity, but actually critiquing Islam. Sam Harris especially critiqued Islam, and that was one of those religions where people were a little bit less bold to critique, and so he actually perhaps got known more for his critique of Islam than even for critiquing Christianity.
Now, there's a couple things I want to talk in a minute about, just kind of their current influence, but especially Christopher Hitchens was, I think, more of a history guy, kind of looking at the history of the church, and I know Sam Harris saw himself as more of a scientist.
He was did his PhD actually in neuroscience.
Okay, so he's looking at it from that perspective, and I there's at least my impression, and a lot of that I just picked up from you along the way, but I think Hitchens, and sometimes I think the frustrating thing with guys like that is that they would criticize the church and religion for being unscientific and so on, being careless and taking leaps of faith and so on. But then they wouldn't always represent the church fairly. My attitude's always like, look, if religion is so bad, you don't need to make stuff up about them. Like just look at the hard facts and critique those, and that's fair game. But when you start overgeneralizing and you nitpick and kind of pick out the bad stuff and you ignore the good stuff, that's not necessarily a fair scientific critique. And so for Hitchens, that struck me is that's what he would do. But Harris, I know so maybe touch on that. And then Harris is your specialty. And I know for your dissertation, again, he would critique the church and religion and say it's all false, but then he would try to build an ethic without God. And he kept having to borrow from Christianity or religion. I mean, if you just have evolution, it's hard to come up with an ethic that you should be kind to those who are weaker than you or needier than you. That's not the survival of the fittest model. And so it just seemed like, even though they're trying to be very scientific and rational, they both had their own sort of leaps of faith, and they were not always as true to science perhaps as they would like to make you think.
Yeah, well, Hitchens was sort of famous for bringing out the list of wrongdoings of the church, and thing is all of his critiques Christians themselves have talked about, and so he never really brought up anything new. He just brought it up in maybe a new way, but it's not as if he uncovered any sort of historical wrongdoings that the church didn't already know about. Now we should be quick to admit where the church has gone wrong, and maybe one of the unforeseen blessings of their critiques was that it made the church take a closer look at some of these things, and we should be the ones who are first to admit where we've gone wrong in history. And so a lot of his critiques were actually valid critiques. They just weren't anything new, right?
Yeah.
Like it was stuff that we sort of like, well, yeah, like the Crusades and like those sorts of things. Like we know about that, and books and books and books have been written about that stuff already. But what struck me in his book especially was, it's like he couldn't bring himself to admit that the church did anything, because the subtitle of the book was How Religion Poisons Everything. So he couldn't bring himself to admit where religion went right.
Yeah. So when you explain away all the orphanages and all the ministry to the poor and the hungry and the sick and the hospitals started by Christians,
and even science that he so values, and like all those things, and the example in the book that I kind of laughed at was what he's talking about Francis of Assisi, who, I mean, was there a more gentle, caring soul than Francis of Assisi? But Francis was also famous for caring for nature, even to the point of preaching to creation. And so he briefly mentions Francis of Assisi and says, who preached to birds, like mockingly. And then he brings up Francis again later on. And then in brackets, he has who preached to birds, like as if like don't get sidetracked by the good things Francis did because he was also crazy, you know, like,
Yeah.
and it's one of those things where it's sort of like those little asides, like it's like you can't just admit that someone did some good stuff as a Christian. And so you're right. It's easy to, and we could do the same thing for atheists. And oftentimes maybe we as the church do. We like to bring up, you know, communism and these sorts of things that like, look at what atheist regimes have done. And we fail to give any credit, maybe where credit could be due. And so we can do the same sort of thing. But then Harris, as more of a scientist and less of maybe a sort of social commentator, at least at the time when he was writing, he's kind of become more of that now. But his whole thing was, if we want to get rid of religion, if religion serves no positive purpose at all, then most of what people have seen religion as doing is being a foundation for morality. And that's sort of always been the thing, like, well, if you get rid of religion, you get rid of morality. And that's sort of what Nietzsche even said, like way before, is, hey, look, if God is dead, then something's going to have to replace him. And we're sort of in trouble because we don't necessarily have something good to replace him with. And so Harris is determined to say, well, no, we can start from a starting place of science. We don't need God to exist in order to, and the things that they would typically say is like, well, so are you telling me that if God didn't exist, everything would fall into anarchy and we'd all start killing each other? And we'd say no, because we believe that there's this innate sense of morality within people that God put there. But if you take God away, you take away the justification and the foundation for morality. On what foundation is there if there's not a good God who created morality into the very fabric of the world?
And isn't there the saying, is does not equal ought, or does not lead to ought?
Yeah, you can't get an ought from an is. So you can't just say this is the way, you know, this is the way humans are, you know, whatever, like this, like they're made up of these cells and they function this way, and therefore, like, we should treat each other in this way. It's like, no, you can say it's prudent for survival to treat each other this way. And, you know, you don't want to go around killing all your neighbors and having mistrust everywhere because like that's not going to be a good world for anybody. And so there's a lot of overlap of saying, well, yeah, we agree on what oftentimes what morality looks like. The difference is the foundations of where it comes from. And so for Harris, he would say, well, we can start with like well-being. You know, everyone's seeking well-being, and science, the science of the brain and everything, shows us what well-being is. But what he does is he starts with a presupposition that happiness and well-being just is the point of morality. And it's like, well, but what he's doing is a step of faith. He's saying you have to start, and he says this in his way, like, you have to start somewhere. And we would say the same thing. Well, yeah, you have to start somewhere. And the somewhere that we start is with a God who created and ordered the universe, whose very nature and character is good and is the standard by which everything else is measured against. And he would say, well, I start somewhere else. And each of us has to start by faith with a presupposition. And he never really brings himself to admit that he actually starts by faith too.
Right. If you take a scientific view, then it's like, that's not faith, that's science. As if science doesn't have to also take steps of faith.
Yeah, well, and everyone has to take presupposition. Like, you have to start somewhere. You have to start by assuming something's true.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like, you can't go back far enough, right?
Well, you know, there's an interesting thing too that I think is intriguing to me, because you sometimes wonder about people that are, I mean, flat out atheists. There's lots of agnostics who just say, I'm not sure. There may be a God. There's some things that seem to indicate that, but then I've got these doubts or questions. Like, that's probably a much bigger category. But the actual flat out, no, there is absolutely no God, atheist, it's a much smaller percentage of people. But it is interesting when you start to peel back some of the layers of that. You find oftentimes, and I would say always, but certainly a surprising number of times where some of these famous atheists have, when they were children, they were maybe abused by a priest or hurt by a religious person, and what you find is they're not necessarily rational atheists. They're angry atheists. They're angry at having been abused, and I mean certainly that's justifiable, but to then have that drive them to insist that there's, if your father abused you as a child, you don't want to believe that there's a heavenly father, that God is a father figure. And is that kind of overstated? Like, I know Dawkins, for one, I think is someone that, maybe a leading atheist today, and yet he had something like that happen in his life when he was a child. It's almost like they just refuse to even be open to the thought. I mean, you think scientists are supposed to do that. I mean, it's supposed to be at least open to the possibility of a God existing or something, but they don't even have that they're not even open to that possibility.
Yeah, and obviously you can't generalize all of sort of any belief system, but there certainly, it does seem to be a trend with a certain brand of atheists,
Mm-hmm.
and typically the ones that were really vocal and angry and that really sided with the these four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they called themselves, these new atheists. Like, oftentimes those who really felt camaraderie with them were those who were really emotionally upset, and often understandably so. That's the thing, is a lot of these guys had a lot of reason to be upset, and so sometimes I know the tendency is to almost combat in the same, defend the faith in the same sort of way as it's being attacked, rather than stopping and saying, like, behind all the emotion, what's the point that's being made? And there's an interesting book called Faith of the Fatherless that looks at that trend. And it, obviously it doesn't interview tens of thousands of people, but it looks at, like, the real famous vocal atheists, like the Nietzsches and the Dawkinses and those guys, and it does find that oftentimes they had either an absent or an abusive father in their life, and I mean, we know that fathers play a huge role in family life, and so it's just sort of this interesting hypothesis of looking at that. And then we also know that, like, psychologists are telling us that we're all really emotional beings, and even those who like the new atheists, they always claim to be the rational ones. Like the religious people are the ones who go by faith and emotion, and we're just like logic and reason and facts. And psychologists today would tell us, well, even the most rational among us is primarily driven by emotion, and reason sort of comes in later. But you read the books by these guys, and it's full of emotion, and nobody escapes that, right? Us or them. And so oftentimes it seems like the starting point for their lack of faith was emotional, and then certainly logic and reason came in and played a part in that,
to buttress what they felt.
But it's likely not that they first just came to their conclusions rationally. I mean, it's complicated, right? Like, that emotion and reason work together in complicated ways, but for them to sort of put themselves out there as we're the rational ones, not biased through our emotions, is really just not true. The same way as we couldn't say that either. Like, we're all human, and we're all a complicated mixture of emotion and reason.
Well, and you know this much better than I do, but I think it's interesting. Christopher Hitchens, that was such an adamant atheist, but then there was an apologist that became his friend, and they did engage in debate, but beyond that, there was a Christian that just tried to love him as a person, a hurting person, and I believe Hitchens. There's no record that he ultimately became a believer, but he certainly was impressed with a Christian that didn't just see him as the arch enemy, but as a hurting person that needed to be loved and understood. And I believe Hitchens' brother actually is a believer. I think I read a book by him at one point.
Yeah, Peter Hitchens. Interesting. Two brothers. They're both kind of belligerent and opinionated and brash, but went very different directions as far as what they believed, grew up in the same home, but went very different directions as far as faith came. And it is interesting that, Christopher Hitchens, most of the Christians he seems to have really been around were people he was debating. And yet when he actually spent time with one as a friend, and they took a road trip together and they read through the book of John while they drove on this road trip, and they talked about it. And yeah, I would definitely wouldn't want to overstate the case, but basically there was a side to Hitchens, that was, and this is probably true of just about everybody. Like when you get him off the stage away from the microphone, there was a certain side to him that was a little bit less boisterous, like a little bit less, okay, when you're outside of the spotlight, not necessarily that he was hypocritical, because I think he believed what he said from the stage, but I think it didn't really give you the full picture of kind of what he was mulling over in his mind and in his heart. And he even admitted at one point, they asked him, is there anything, like, what's the strongest case for Christianity or for God? Even though you don't believe it, what would be the strongest case? And he said, the design that he sees in the universe. He said, he doesn't believe that points to God, but he said that would be the strongest case that he sees.
It's interesting. I had the opportunity to teach a class at Oxford University in Wycliffe College, and I was, one of the other teachers was John Lennox, of course, very, very pronounced apologist, and he was saying that Dawkins, who has a house there in Oxford as well, lets out rooms in his house to Oxford students, and to earn some rent revenue, I guess, and but that he always connected with this evangelical college there at Oxford, and when asked why, like, what, you're an atheist, why is it you're going to the strongest, kind of most outspoken Christian college in the whole place to fill your house up with those kind of people? And when he came to shove, he admitted, well, because they're the most trustworthy. They won't party, they won't destroy my house, they'll pay their rent on time. And
who was it? Voltaire or I don't know, remember who it was. Somebody famous atheist basically said he wants his barber and banker and all. He wants all those people to be Christians. Yeah, because he just trusts them more.
Yeah, and maybe he's being consistent to say, like, I understand if you're an atheist like me, you're not entirely trustworthy, but there's no one holding you accountable. As a Christian, at least, believes that they will be accountable, so they have to kind of monitor their behavior. But maybe just the last kind of area just to explore here in the time left, and that is these guys, I don't know, from the early 2000s, for maybe 20 years, these guys, Hitchens has passed away, but they've had they were writing some very best-selling books. They were in a lot of different interviews and so on. But in some ways, Harris is still around doing some stuff that I've noticed, but are they the sort of the tip of the spear as far as the atheist kind of movement today, or is that perhaps shifting to some other areas now?
Yeah, like I'm not totally up to date on a lot of that stuff, but you certainly see a lot less of those guys. Hitchens passed away several years ago now. Dawkins is getting up there in age as well, but those guys, they sort of had their time. And there's not a lot from them anymore. They haven't really written anymore on religion. Dawkins would always say that his first love is science, and he doesn't really want to write more about religion. It made him a lot of money, but he's sort of like, and I believe him, that like what he really loves is science. That's what he wants to write about. And Harris actually has gotten really into his podcast. He does a spirituality podcast, because the other interesting
meditation, isn't it?
The other interesting thing about him is he was very critical of religion, but he was very open to spirituality, and a lot of that was he wrote a book called Waking Up, which is basically how does an atheist fulfill that spiritual void that he would admit that we have. And so, like meditation has been a huge thing for him, and sort of a lot of that Eastern religion type stuff. And so it's really been interesting too, because they've both been vocal against some of the cultural trends and philosophies that are bouncing around right now. And you've actually seen a lot of unlikely allies. And so some of these guys like Harris have actually been on some conservative religious podcasts and interviews and stuff. And really fascinating to see, like, hey, we disagree about a lot of stuff, but the cultural moment right now, there's actually a lot that we agree on, and sort of unlikely allies.
I know, like with, like, say, transgenderism, for instance, I think they would, from a scientific background, a person like Harris would disagree with a lot of the popular trends today and actually side with more of a Christian conservative view, which has been quite ironic to see a leading atheist siding and fighting on the same side, perhaps, as
Well, you know what's interesting? I forget where I heard this, but I think it was Dawkins who might have said, like, in all his time critiquing religion and stuff, like he's actually been treated really well by those that he critiques. And so he would go, and I think he was talking specifically about, like, Alabama. And, you know, like he's coming from Oxford, England. He's going to Alabama, the heart of the Bible Belt. And he's at a Christian school is where he's doing this debate. And he said, like, they were so charitable to him. Like, they treated him so well, even though he's, like, critiquing their most deeply held beliefs. And yet when these guys criticize sort of common, like, modern gender ideology, I mean, they're getting slammed and threatened, and they're saying, like, man, like, you know, when we critiqued religion, when we could critique specifically Christianity, we never got treated like this. But when we critique certain political viewpoints, cultural trends, like we're getting like all sorts of hate coming back on us. And in one sense, it's a little bit of like, and I don't like using like this sort of language because I don't think it's a good way to frame it, but sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they're actually finding some alliances with other people who, hey, we disagree about all the religion stuff, but some of the cultural stuff we actually agree on, or some of what we see to be standards of truth, or those sorts of things. And so in one sense, when many of maybe their former crowd has abandoned them, it's a lot of religious people who have been there to embrace, and we can be pretty fickle too, as far as, like, anybody who shows any sort of commonality with us, we'll embrace them as a hero and kick them out if they you know, cause too much trouble or whatever. But it's been interesting that that many of those that they have spent the latter part of their career criticizing have actually been pretty open in forming sort of these unofficial alliances. And in one sense, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in there, but in one sense, I hope that's a sign of Christians just showing common grace and charity and forgiveness, and saying, even though you have critiqued and sort of bombasted things that I hold dear, like, I'm not gonna treat you that way. And even if your own side rejects you, like, our arms are always open. And a lot of that is more to do with political stuff than it is with spiritual stuff. But hopefully we as Christians can say even our worst critics are welcome into our tribe if they can find a place there. And so hopefully there's some forgiveness going around, because, you know, I feel like they've sort of had their day. And I would say that now that the critique of religion has shifted, and more like the deconstruction movement of former Christians, former worship leaders, former pastors, the Josh Harris types who kind of walked away from the faith that they used to preach. And in one sense, they're offering some really good and valid critique that we should listen to. But in another sense, it can be kind of dangerous, because you've got guys oftentimes for emotional reasons or experiential reasons who are leaving the faith. Guys like Harris and Dawkins always criticized from the outside. I think the new trend right now is to criticize from the inside. And again, like, if there's truth to the criticisms, then we should be quick to listen to those. But I would say the new atheism, I don't think holds a ton of weight these days. I think a lot of their arguments have been answered. I think the new thing is this deconstruction, which often leads to deconversion. And so I think the new thing for apologetics is how do we engage with that?
Yeah, and I know again you can't overgeneralize because there's lots of different motivations, but I do sense that at least some of these that are leaving the faith that used to be champions of it, sometimes they end up like having an affair, and all of a sudden the morality that they believed in before is not convenient anymore. It's easy to say, well, I just don't believe all that anymore because now I'm going to live a gay lifestyle, or I'm going to marry my lover, and some of these Christian morals, that's not convenient anymore, so I'm going to walk away from that. But it would be interesting, again, there's lots of reasons, but oftentimes what is pronounced as, well, I've just discovered truth, or I'm trying to follow reason, or whatever else, so many of those you start to unpack and you realize, well, there's more to it than that. And
and again, it's not typically new arguments. Like, there'll be guys who say, I just can't come to terms with the doctrine of hell. Well, people have been talking about that since day one.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like, I don't, I can't handle the violence in the Old Testament. Or, I mean, these, in one sense, it's sort of the classic stuff, the problem of evil, things that have always been around.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just fascinating. It's fascinating just the way it's coming across, that like it's being critiqued by those who were formerly on the inside instead of those from the outside. And so in one sense, it's being critiqued by people who have heard a lot of the answers before. And I think it's something that we should take note of, that these are people who grew up in our churches, and yet the way that we handled those issues and those questions ultimately wasn't satisfying for them. And obviously there's a lot of emotional reasons that go into stuff. Very rarely do you hear somebody say, I just couldn't get behind Jesus. I didn't like what Jesus did or said.
Yeah.
And so I left the faith. It's almost always Old Testament stuff, or hell, or personal experience. The church hurt me.
Yeah.
And I mean, when you see all the Christian leaders that are publicly falling, there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us.
Yeah, and I think too, it also tells you be careful about putting people on pedestals, because this guy's a current Christian music artist right now that's popular and has a following, and then they come out and say, well, I never believed all that stuff, or whatever. It's it happens, and I think it certainly shouldn't crumble your faith because a Christian artist turned their back on their faith. But like you say, I think it should be something that we do look at it as we're raising certainly young people, teaching them to think, and certainly, we try to do that. Just kind of on a personal note, we tried to do that as best we could with you kids when you were all kids. Not a gray-haired apologetic pastor now, but or gray-bearded. But we, I don't think we're not doing our kids any favor by not teaching them how to think and to address those kind of issues. They might as well deal with those issues while they're still at home and going to church, and pull out your Bible and say, well, I mean, what does the Bible say about some of these issues? And not let people change their minds on an issue based on what's going on in their personal life, but say there's got to be a truth that's bigger than my personal life and experience. And so lots to talk about, Mike. I knew that we would kind of race through our time here, but I want to grab the opportunity while I had you near a microphone, because there's a lot of people like me that read a lot, hear a lot, but we're not really experts in apologetics. And certainly these atheist Dawkins and some of these guys Harris keeps popping up, and I think the average person just sort of feels outgunned, because you got a neuroscientist talking, and yet you kind of peel back a lot of that. I'd certainly recommend anyone wants to read a good dissertation on Sam Harris to read Mike's dissertation, where he unpacks what he says and where there's some links and leaps of faith, even in an atheist kind of ethic. And so thanks for being with us. And we'll leave, there might be some books. We may just kind of get Mike to help put in the show notes that are, if you're interested in this subject and would like to read a little bit more, we might leave a few resources there just to and let you follow up on that. But thanks a lot, Mike, for being with us, and probably need to go and check in on those kids now.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.